Hey, what's up everybody? Coming back with another video. This one is talking about New World and the changes that they've made to the New World PvP. In the article, The Evolution of New World PvP that came out on December 12th in, excuse me, in what is referred to as their dev diaries. I'll link the article at the bottom of the video. So basically, this is talking about some of the changes that they've made to their PvP. New World originally was designed around open world PvP. Excuse me. That has subsequently kind of been thrown out. Not entirely, but it's on its way out. So basically, I'm going to touch on what the Q&A from the developers talking about PvP, kind of why they've made some of the changes. Let's jump right in.
We've been getting a lot of great questions across social media, Reddit, the forums, about how New World has evolved over the past several months. We had our big announcement at the Game Awards, and people have been asking us a lot of questions on how PvE, PvP works. Can you tell us a little bit about how New World has brought more PvE elements into the game?
Let me start with the previous alpha. When we were live, we watched players play, we played with players, and we learned a whole bunch. One of the things that we noticed was players were engaging in PvP, but a lot more players wanted more PvE content. They wanted more things they could solo. They wanted the ability to be directed through the world. They wanted more enemies. Our big focus has been about...
And I think that just touching on this very quickly, when you eventually cater to PvEers in what is in essence a PvP game, it will have an effect over the longevity of your game. The Elder Scrolls Online is a perfect example of that, where the super casual players come in and they'll say, well, we want more solo content. This was a big thing in ESO, where the game originally was designed around grouping. The PvE in the game was initially quite difficult, especially early on in the game. And eventually what happened was the PvE of the game actually got quite easy, and eventually what happens is basically that lowers the skill level of the players overall when you have really easy content, and then players then go into PvP and then they realize that they don't know how to defend themselves, they don't know how to heal themselves, they don't know how to engage in combat. And so this, I think, will primarily is just starting to rear its head, where PvEers are coming in and they're saying, well, like he said, well, we want more solo content, right? It's an MMO. It's an MMO. It's designed around grouping. It's designed around working with other players to achieve a common goal. And right in the very beginning, what you see is the appeasement that takes place within PvP games, where PvPers then come and interject about why can't we have X, Y, and Z, and we'll discuss more of that in a minute.
Appeasing those players, putting more POIs in the game, increasing the density of POIs, increasing the complexity, putting more curation into the world. So as you're moving through the world difficulty grows, it ramps up accordingly to where you are. And along with that comes the loot that you get. We've added a lot more loot that gets better as you fight harder enemies. So all together, the game's going to feel a little more balanced between the PvP and PvE. Probably.
So this, I thought, was a really good point that he talks about initially. And this is how ESO worked initially as well. And I'll discuss, and just as talking about that one topic where he said initially, where the PvE starts to get a little bit harder and harder and harder. And of course, as you take on harder and harder enemies, you then get rewarded based on the risk reward, right? Really easy mobs obviously don't drop some of the best gear. That is quite the opposite in the Elder Scrolls Online, where much of the gear is dropped by basically face roll mobs that you can literally sit and just click your left mouse over and over and over again, and then they will die. And then you get some of the best loot in the game. And so what happened eventually, as the PvE got super easy, and then they started introducing harder content that was designed more for endgame, now you have this super casual player base who then complains about the top tier players. Like, they start complaining, well, my class isn't viable, etc. I can't do X, Y, and Z, or this skill, needs to get buffed, or, this class is overpowered and needs to get nerfed. This will eventually come to bite them in the ass.
Probably leaning with a little bit more PvE focus.
So during the alpha, there was a heavy emphasis on the PvP side of the game. Players are
And obviously so, it's a PvP game.
concerned that some of that might be going away. What about PvP has changed in New World?
Our initial vision was a full PvP session, but we were trying to come up with ways to make it so that experienced high-level players wouldn't just PK, cheap kill like new players, so they wouldn't go attack wounded players. And everything we tried just kind of felt like a Band-Aid and didn't really solve the problem. So what we're thinking about now is giving both players that experience so everyone can come to a tournament and have a good time. So we put an opt-in system. We've added factions to the game, so you'll join a faction. And when you hit a certain level, you're allowed to opt into PvP. Anyone who opts in can engage in open world PvP. This also leads to wars, which is where PvP was its most fun in the last alpha. And we've put a lot of work into making war more fun. We've added siege weapons, more defense, we've added more stages to the war. When you start to play this, you're gonna see how this is how we really meant PvP to be.
And I wanted to touch on a couple of things that he talked about the more experienced, higher level players griefing lower level players. This is typically seen among low skilled players who know that if they were fighting against an evenly leveled opponent that they would lose. So what do is they go to the lower level areas to basically grief lower level players because they're typically unskilled players. And so this happened in many different games that I play, like for example Lineage 2, where you would get people who would come out and would grief lower level players, and then the people would just type in chat and be like, hey, there's this person griefing. This happened in like Age of Conan, for example, and in Ion. And for the most part, what would happen is people would just type in chat, and then somebody who was a little bit higher level, or you'd get a group of the same level players would come and fight that player and kill him and eventually drive him off. Because eventually you would get either overwhelmed by numbers or someone of equal level would come and eventually kill the person who was griefing, and that person would go on and do something else, and then you would be able to go back and level, as you were before without any problems. But at the very least, it created content, player-driven content, where it gave you kind of that essence of fear of going out into the world and perhaps being attacked by a player. So you have to watch out both from the PvE aspect, where maybe the mobs within the world were fairly difficult, but then you also had to worry about the PvPer coming in and trying to attack you. So it gave the whole world like a sense of dread. The other thing that he talks about is flagging. A flagging system is very boring. If people want to only PvE, then what you would see in MMOs is where they would have just PvE servers, right? Either you'd go to, if you only wanted to PvE, well, then they gave you a Care Bear server that you can go on, and then you can PvE to your heart's content. And you don't have to worry about anybody coming in and attacking you, and you could still PvP, but it would be based off of flagging. But on a PvP server, it was basically a free-for-all where everybody was open to being flagged at any time. And so it gave players a choice of just PvPing with a flag system and then open world 100% PvP. And even then, you would still get the Care Bears would come to the PvP server and still complain about the PvP. There is nothing that you can do to appease such individuals. They just are there to complain. And so you can't cater to that style of player. The other problem that they'll end up running into is balancing between both PvP and PvE, especially when they start introducing more and more gear into the game, where at least games like, for example, Guild Wars kind of separated them to two, and WoW having both PvP gear and PvE gear. And Ion also did the exact same thing.
Will it be possible to engage with New World and not touch PvP at all?
If you never want to PvP, you can absolutely avoid it. I believe that as players play through the PvE experience, they're going to eventually want to try it and get a taste for it when they get comfortable with the combat style and the gameplay. But it is absolutely a gameplay path that you can do it without ever playing in PvP.
And I think that's a big mistake that they're doing, because the game, either your game is primarily focused on PvP, or it's primarily focused on PvE in terms of its development. This is a problem that we've seen in the Elder Scrolls Online, where as the game starts becoming more casual, your end game PvPers start to leave the game. And so what happens is you get a wave of super casuals that come in and post in the forums that my class isn't viable, or this ability needs to get buffed. And then you'll have theory crafters that will come in, show you how your class is more than viable. You maybe have learned to play issues, and developers fear telling players that maybe you have learned to play issues. And so what inevitably happens is the artificial dumbing down of game. The developers end up making changes to both classes and abilities off of low skilled players, instead of taking it from higher skilled players who both understand that the game that is developed before them and are good at it. And so this typically happens when you mesh both PvE and PvP, and then you start to cater more towards PvEers. The reason being is because typically no PvEer is going on the forum saying, hey, I kill all these mobs really easy, I love it, right? They're not saying please nerf it, right? If anything, they're saying quite the opposite, or they just don't say anything at all. Things that are broken in PvE, people typically don't necessarily care that much about, and that's why many of these games that have both, the PvE aspect of the game ends up infringing upon the PvP aspect of the game, and one becomes overpowered. Typically the PvE side of the game, as the developers start to appease the PvEers. This has happened in the Elder Scrolls Online throughout its longevity. From once they started leaning towards PvE, the game started becoming much easier, started catering to casuals. Then you have started to have class imbalances. Once you go the class imbalance route, inevitably comes in the why can this class do this and that class can't, and my class can't? Or why is this class has this ability and my class doesn't? Why is their DPS, I'm a healer class, why can't I do just as much damage as a DPS class? And inevitably what happens is you have the meshing of classes and you remove class diversity. This happened in the Elder Scrolls Online and in many other games. And this typically what happens when you cater towards the PvE side, when your original goal is to be PvP.
So during the alpha, when players would come across another player, they would kill them, all your loot would drop. You would kind of go back to zero. What's the state of that in...
This actually existed in Lineage 2, which was a great aspect of the game. It's literally one of the things that I've looked for, which is why I got involved with the Elder Scrolls Online, because originally they promised a justice system, which got scrapped because of PvE. Because the PvEers complained, I didn't want to get killed in the middle of, doing things, whether the people who wanted to role play as thieves didn't want the repercussions of being attacked by players for stealing. And so what happens is a whole entire aspect of the game got removed because of the cries of PvEers who wanted to roleplay as thieves, but then didn't want to be attacked by players. And this happens in the Elder Scrolls Online, and the justice system in that game is a complete joke. It's super easy to get away from guards. Most people who take advantage, who do get involved in stealing, because of the Thief Guild, are typically Nightblades that just utilize cloak. It's very boring and with no risk for ridiculous reward when it comes to stealing, and it artificially killed what could have been a beautiful aspect to that game. Lineage 2, on the other hand, had an aspect of what they were referring to of flagging red, where you murdered a player who didn't attack you back. You in essence turned red, your character name would turn red, and then everybody else was able to attack you and didn't have to flag, even though each could flag on each other. But when you flagged, your character name turned purple. It was white. When you flagged on someone, it turned purple. And when you killed the person, it turned red, which meant that everybody could attack you. And as a result, the penalty for doing that was you could drop a lot of the gear that you were in possession of, whether you were equipped it or if it was just sitting in your inventory. And so this provided both a risk and reward, where you could kill someone who was acting like an asshole. Maybe they were talking shit to you and chatting. You're like, you know what? I'm going to PK you and get you out of my area and send you back to spawn. Or if you just wanted to fight over a territory, maybe someone was XPing in a really good area, and then all of a sudden somebody else would come over and start stealing your mobs, and you'd be like, what the fuck, bro? Like, can't you see I'm XPing here? And it gave you the opportunity to flag on them and to kill them. And this is an entire aspect of the game that was literally removed because of Care Bears. People are just afraid of that aspect, the danger of coming into a world where I can be killed both by the environment and I can be killed by other players. Instead, I want to opt in. I want to be able to pick and choose when I come into these, and it provides for a very boring and mediocre, which is more than likely what is going to happen with New World. Mark my words.
New World now.
So now for the open world opt-in PvP, the penalty is really time. The time it takes you to get back to where you were. We're not going to have you lose anything. We found that players found that crushing to not only get beat up, but to drop everything they had on them.
That happened in Lineage too. If you PK'd someone, guess what? That was the risk that you took, was that that person could come back or somebody else walking along could come back and they'd kill you and you would drop your shit. That was the risk you took in killing someone. That's how you handle risk versus reward.
A bit much. So we've softened the blow on that. The player winning the war or winning the battle with another player will still get some rewards.
So there is incentive to flag yourself as PvP. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we haven't fully refined the system yet, but we are going to give you bonuses for being flagged for PvP. So you might get a little more experience, you might get slightly better rewards when you're flagged. All of this stuff is totally attainable while you're playing PvE, but it adds more risk being flagged for PvP, so we want to make sure you have more reward.
And I agree with them that there should be risk versus reward. Inevitably, what will happen, which happened in the Elder Scrolls Online, was that PvEers who primarily want a PvE will complain to no avail that it's unfair that I have to flag and I'm being forced to flag, right? You'll see that. I guarantee you will see this in the forums. Why do I have to be forced to flag and I'm missing out on extra XP, or I'm missing out on rewards, or I'm missing out on extra gold? Why are you forcing me to flag? I tell you not, this shit will be on the forums to no avail as more super casuals start to come into the game because it starts to cater to PvEers. This will inevitably happen. It happened in the Elder Scrolls Online. Originally, there were multiple campaigns and you were supposed to fight over the campaign. It was originally divided into factions. And when you controlled the campaign, your faction got a little bit more XP. They got a little bit more gold. They got a little bit more for like mining, etc., for gathering. And everybody complained to no avail. So the developers added more servers. And then all the servers became buff campaigns where one faction owned that server, the other faction owned, and everybody in essence got the reward, which completely diminished the value of the reward if everybody got it. And then there was only one faction, there was only one PvP server where everybody PvP'd on, making all the other servers completely pointless. So then they removed those servers and then they completely removed the reward system, which completely removed an aspect of the game, which then pushed players to come in PvP. Now, since there was no reward, you just literally drove people away. This will inevitably happen in this game if they don't take a stand for PvP.
So we talk a lot about large-scale PvP. Is it going to be more of a instance scenario, or is there going to be large-scale PvP in the open world?
I think both are going to be options. Our war, I wouldn't say it's instance, but it's 50v50.
So what they're referring to is he says he thinks there will be both, meaning currently there is no large scale PvP. It's very important to hear that. Their instance PvP is what he's referring to, the 50v50, right? Which is basically large scale battlegrounds. This will propose a problem, and I'll discuss it in a second.
And no one else can enter the war. So once you're in this area, we shield everyone else out. In the open world PvP, groups can absolutely form, and that could also end up being large scale. It just depends how organized people get.
It only will form when players choose to flag.
Is there still a criminal system in the game? In the original alpha, we had a criminal system that players could, they would get flagged as a criminal and there are penalties to that. How does that work into the current version of PvP?
Because you're opt-in?
This is what I was talking about before. The justice system completely removed catering to casuals.
We really know there's no need for the criminal system where everyone's getting attacked.
Right? In Lineage 2, one of the best things about this was that when a player killed another player, you could open up your map. Later on, they introduced this, which was called the bounty system. And so what happened was when you killed another opponent, the more players you killed, because maybe somebody else came out to kill you, and maybe they weren't as skilled as you, and then you killed them, subsequently gaining more karma, because that's what they had. They had a karma system, so when you killed someone, you gained X amount of karma. And then you had to kill PvE mobs to work off the karma. The more players you killed while you were red, the more karma you accumulated, the harder it was for you to basically get rid of that karma, because you had the risk of dropping your gear, which meant it made it harder for you basically to do that, where you always ran the risk, or then you had to go out there and use like shitty gear to try to get off the karma, but then it made it harder for you to remove the karma because you killed slower, and then maybe had to kill with a buddy, and if they healed you, then they would get flagged for PvP because you were in essence red, you were karma, and anyone who was in essence on your side who would heal you or buff you would flag themselves for PvP, opening them up to be killed. And so you could basically open up your map onto the game, and you would see where people who had bounties, and it made it easier to find them. So, and then you got gold for killing them. And so there was both a player-driven system as well as a developer system in place for handling people who want to go, in essence, and PK people who are either lower level than them or less skilled than them.
Has made that decision.
And this got completely scrapped because of PvE.
So we've removed the criminal system.
It's starting
Territory
already.
control
The game isn't even out, and PvEers are already infringing upon a game that is designed for PvP.
Important in New World. Does the way territory changes hands require PvP?
Absolutely.
This will be a problem again for PvEers. PvEers will complain, why am I being forced, right? You'll see that. I guarantee you there will be numerous forums talking about why am I being forced and not being able to have these territories because I don't want to PvE. So people who don't want to opt into PvE are in a sense excluded from this forum. This all goes back basically to people who just have the mentality of they're owed something just because they purchased the game.
If you own a territory that I want, I have to get a group together, my company, and we're going to have to declare war on you. The winner of that war takes ownership of the territory. Other than at the very beginning, when all of the world, no one owns anything, it is impossible to get a territory without war.
So in New World, will there be PvE dungeons and raids and those types of things?
They're not going to be like you traditionally would expect, where you get teleported to one. There will be bosses in the world that require groups to work together to overcome, similar to like world bosses. We may end up growing down the path of adding dungeons and raids. We talk about it a lot. Our bigger goal is to get what we have in front of players and start to see what they want and where they push us and help us kind of take the
A lot
draft.
of issues with high-level players going down and killing new players who had no experience and no opportunities to explore what New World had to offer. What steps did we take to address that?
Well, the opt-in PvP system is a huge step toward that.
What he's referring to is PKing, right? Player killing. The way that Lineage dealt with this, which is the way that I already discussed, where communities would get together, right? People, if you got killed by a player, typically people would just type in chat, hey, there's a griefer, this level, this class in this area, and people would go and kill him. And so the community itself took care of that problem.
You have to be.
And instead of the developers waiting and seeing how things played out on a larger scale, instead of taking a very small scale of people who came into their closed alpha, they've completely removed an aspect of their game before letting it see fruition and seeing how the community would handle it, which I think is a mistake that will come back to bite them.
And you have to be level 10
And primarily the people, I guarantee you, who were complaining about this were PvEers.
to join a faction. So the earliest you could ever even contemplate PvP is level 10. And I think most players will want to wait just a little beyond that and get a little stronger foothold on how the combat and the gameplay works. There is no scenario where, as a new player, you wake up on the beach and have a spear get jammed in your throat. That won't.
And this actually, unfortunately, removed what could have been a beautiful aspect of the game. Way back playing in Lineage 2, you saw people who would do exactly that. You'd get a guy who was maybe a few levels higher, and he would flag on low levels. And so what would happen is a whole bunch of groups of low levels would get together and fight a higher level player, which made it feel like an artificial world boss, because you were fighting a player who was much higher than you, who maybe had better gear than you, and in essence everybody would band together and basically take care of him. It was literally like what would happen in real life, where you had a bully in school and all the little kids get together and they like, let's gang up on them all together as one. And unfortunately, this is an aspect of the game that was completely removed via catering to PvEers.
Won't happen.
Not to mention, like what I said before about how they could have easily done this with the justice system. Had they left the justice system in, this exact same problem happened in the Elder Scrolls Online, where originally the Elder Scrolls Online promised to have a justice system, and because the game started catering more and more and more prior to the desired release of the justice system, PvEers complained. And what happened? ESO scrapped the idea in its entirety.
One of the aspects of PvP and war is the idea of more of PvP by appointment. What are some of the bonuses?
Which is basically, in essence, battlegrounds.
Big
Just
one
large scale
you don't
battlegrounds.
get the group that logs in at 2 a.m. and comes and attacks your stuff when you're not there. So
and of course, what he's referring to is night capping, right? Which happens in ESO and it happens in many other games where territories are acquired, and then you'd get oceanic players that would come in, or people who were like from Europe and played on the NA server, and then most of them were around during the nighttime when NA is either at work or sleeping. And then they would come in and cap, and then you'd come in and everything would be flipped, and then you'd have to come in and do it all over again. So this is basically their way of dealing with that. But it does create another problem.
To be present to defend it. It also allows companies that own land to set appointment times around when they play, right? So, hey, we all get off work at 6, we're all home at 8 every night ready to play. We want to go to war around 8 or 9 o'clock. Someone else might like work night shift, and they might want to find a group that has wars happen around 2 in the afternoon because that's more convenient for them. It allows more players to experience the feature around their schedule.
And the primary problem with this, you might be thinking, well, hey, that sounds like a great idea. It sounds like a decent way of dealing with night capping. The primary problem is what inevitably will happen with this game is as it starts to lose its PvP player base because of constantly catering to PvEers, you'll find less people who are willing to, in essence, get into these 50v50. Think about it. It's already difficult as it is in the Elder Scrolls Online just to get their battleground system going. Why? Because so few people are now taking part in battlegrounds, which is why queue times are so long. This will inevitably come back to haunt them because of making the mistake of catering to the casual player base.
You're going to pre-order New World, the Deluxe or Standard Edition. Obviously, one of the benefits is getting into the closed beta in April. What are some of the other benefits that you're going to get for pre-ordering the game?
Well, one, you get this really cool amulet, Isabella's amulet. It was in the trailer you saw, the red one that gets pulled out of there.
Oh, right.
So you'll get that. It's a magic amulet that you can use. You'll get a cool title, Expedition 1. So if you happen to play the game for a long time, and people always say they were there since the beginning, you'll have documented proof. We have a pretty cool emote, fist bump.
And the explosion.
And the explosion.
See the explosion in game.
And company crests. So you'll get special crests you can wear on your chest that only your company can use. Companies that pre-order the game.
Will players who played in the early alpha have a special title as well?
And of course,
Absolutely.
that's going to take place here, as it says here.
Well, thank you for your continued
April.
support of New World.
So that's basically the gist of the kind of the changes that are taking place. I have no doubt that the steps that they've taken prior to the game being released are just the beginning of the end of PvP in this game. Because what will happen is you'll get a lot of hardcore PvPers who will come into the game and they'll want things to be, they want competitiveness, they want leaderboards, etc. And when you start to cater to more of the PvEers, what inevitably will happen is PvPers will start to leave. And then more casual players will start to come in, and it will flip the scene entirety of the game. If the developers don't take a stand for PvP, maybe 6 months, a year later, the vision of what originally was their original design, which is probably what is drawing many players, the open world, Ultima Online, lineage 2 type gameplay that they were looking for, will suddenly be downwater. It will be watered down, super casual content. This is kind of what happened. This is what the opposite of basically when you think of the games, for example, like Fortnite. Fortnite originally was a PvE game centered around building forts to fight off waves of zombies. It subsequently started catering more to PvPers, and you see the subsequent result of catering to PvPers. It became literally one of the best games that is out right now, at the very least in terms of revenue and an increasing player base. With that said, I will continue to, as I am monitoring, because I am interested in this game, primarily because it kind of had the vision of what Lineage 2 was, which is kind of what many of you who are familiar with Ashes of Creation. Ashes of Creation promised this very same type style, and then subsequently did a 180 on their player base and released a battle royale. But that's a topic for another video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And of course, I encourage people to comment. And if this is your first time, checking out my content, be sure to hit the follow button and subscribe so that you don't miss out on future content. Thanks for watching. Take care. God bless.